Right.
So yeah, talking about precession.
Yeah. So one of the most interesting sites, well, it's kind of weird because actually the site itself is not a Tikal. It's not a Yasha. It's not great pyramids and all this kind of thing. But there's a very, very interesting site in southwestern Guatemala called Tacalicabac. And Tacalicabac is a very old site, very old. And probably there's some interesting things that we see because we certainly see places like Nakbe, places like Mirador, which are like pre-classic era. Pre-classic runs from 1500 BC through to 250 AD. That's the pre-classic era. And for me, I think I get most interested in what's going on there. And then you've got the classic era runs from 250 to 900 AD. And then after 900, it's post-classic, it's post-collapse kind of thing.
Mm.
So for me, the pre-classic structures are always, and the pre-classic sites are always the most interesting. So we have places like Macbay, places like Mirador up in Petén, but we also have a bunch of places in the Guatemalan highlands and lowlands that also date back that far. Caminal Huyu, which is like just outside of Guatemala City, that dates back that far. But we have these ones on the coastal plains. And we have places like Chocolat, we have places like Chicacao, we have places like Tacalicabac. Now, Tacalicabac, one of the reasons why I find this the most interesting is because there is evidence that it was used not just by the Maya, but also by the Olmec.
Hmm.
And it was almost like a meeting place between the Olmec and the Maya. It was a passing of knowledge. And you also, not so far from there, you have Izapa as well. Izapa, which is thought of being one of the birthplaces of calendars and all that kind of thing. So we see like all of this coastal zone, there's a lot going on. So even though it might not be like massive pyramids that we want to go and climb and, kind of like go and see in that kind of way, there is stuff there that when you know how to look is super, super interesting. Now, one of the things that I find the most interesting about Tacalicabac is that you have two orientations in the plaza there. One orientation is an Olmec orientation, and the other is a Mayan orientation. The Olmec orientation, their temples are aligned to the star Thuban. Thuban is Alpha Draconis in the constellation of Draco. The Maya have theirs aligned to Polaris in, that's the constellation of the Little Dipper. Polaris is our pole star. Now, the interesting thing is what we don't realize until we really start looking into it. We think, let's say we were born, we know a bit about, let's say, celestial navigation or whatever. We know how to find the North Star from the pointers in the Big Dipper or whatever. That's where the pole star is, right? Not 3,000 years ago, it wasn't. Because that cycle of precession is not just about moving from the age of the ram into the age of the fish into the age of Aquarius. That's one way of looking at it, which constellation the sun is going to rise in on the spring equinox. But it's also about the celestial pole wandering, and that celestial pole being, or having a different pole star as we go through life. So like Vega is going to be the pole star in something, I think it's like 14,000 AD or something like that.
Yeah.
But in 3000 BC, Thuban, Alpha Draconis, was the pole star. And this is what the Olmec monuments are pointing at. And so we see that civilization going back. We can time civilizations by looking at what they're pointing at. And we can see that, kind of like if they've got Olmec orientation there and the Maya say, no, it's over there, then we know that they have a perception of precession of the equinoxes. We can also see this. There are things like, for example, precession of the equinoxes will change our view of the sky by 1 degree every 72 years or so. And so every 360 years, you've gone through 5 degrees of precession. And by that point in time, it's really beginning to like, hey, we can see a difference between 350 years ago when we aligned that temple like that, and now when it doesn't work quite. So, we see that these kind of like, what do you call them? The matryoshka, the nesting dolls, right? The pyramids are built like that. And we see little turns of alignment after they realize, hey, hang on, this is not aligned to what we want to align to. And of course, if your civilization, if we go from pre-classic to the end of the classic, we're talking 1500 BC through to 900 AD. 2,400 years, right? You think how our civilization has changed in 200 years or 1,000 years. Think of a civilization or that lasts for 2,500 years. I mean, it's quite, to be quite honest, and like, I'm sorry, I can't really exactly give you the kind of like the data on this precisely. But if you look at the English that was spoken in Britain in 600 AD, none of us would understand Old English. Probably wouldn't understand it from 1200 AD, quite honestly. It will have changed a lot by then. I mean, you look at Shakespeare's "Hey, nonny, nonny" and all that kind of thing. Like the language modifies and changes over that. We're talking 1,500 years. Imagine how language and mathematics and these kind of things would have changed. In fact, you could almost see that you might be looking at a different civilization between the pre-classic and classic eras. This is something which also is very interesting because you see pre-classic eras, they're building monuments, they're using big stones, and then those sites go through a hiatus. Now, a big turning point was 378 AD when Siapkach, who is either called Smoking Frog or Fire is Born, both I think are rather interesting names.
Yeah.
He's a general that comes from Teotihuacan and kind of takes over in Petén. And so all of Petén, like Tikal, Huachatún, places like that, fall under this Teotihuanaco like influence. And the civilization changes. It's like a conquest that comes from central Mexico and says, right, okay, you're under our control now. And you see kind of like the art changes. Now, interestingly enough, they discovered at Tikal not so long ago, a few months back, they were doing an excavation, and what they found was something which looks like an embassy of Teotihuacan there, that they think was established around about 2nd century AD. So, a couple of hundred years before this big, like, okay, by the way, now you're our vassal state kind of thing. It's like a couple of hundred years earlier, they had this Teotihuacan embassy there with lots of Teotihuacan kind of relics there, but also, kind of like, it's like there was trading. They were doing these vast trade routes, bringing these different things in. So going back to that, we see a difference in the architecture post 378 AD. In the classic era, we see a different civilization come in, but I think there's some continuity in there as well. And so if we're looking at the Olmec, going back to the precession kind of thing, we're looking at the Olmec saying, look, there's the pole star, and then the Maya, like 1,500, 2,000 years later, going like, after 3,000 BC, we're now looking at 1,000 BC. 2,000 years later, they're going, actually, no, the pole star's up there now. Let's realign our structures to this. Now, I know that my, let's say my speeches, speeches, my and the way that I express this kind of wanders around a bit. So please excuse that I don't really stick to the point and I wander around it. But the interesting thing is that in El Mirador, and El Mirador kind of went out of fashion about, well, but when the pre-classic ended, that's Tikal rising and Mirador falling. And then there was some like later occupations in sort of the 6th, 7th century. They went and built some more structures, but they weren't like the originals. They weren't like these giant megalithic structures, as far as I can see, or as far as I'm aware anyway. But the interesting thing is when you look around Mirador, you see a lot of temples, dedications. You see a lot of kind of like carvings and that kind of thing, which are dedicated to what is often known as principal bird deity. Now, sometimes they're also calling that Wukub Kakish. Now, that's really interesting because in the Popol Vuh, Wukub Kakish is seen as the false god. And this is where the hero twins are given their what you call it, like their mission from God, their mission from Hunra Khan to go and take out this false god, Seven Makor, Wukub Kakish, and his two sons, Kabra Khan and Zipakna, the earthquake and the maker of mountains. And this is kind of like, for me, this is kind of like how they prove themselves before they go and descend into the underworld and defeat the Lords of Death. Now, why is that interesting? Well, you look at this site, this pre-classic site, and everywhere there, you're seeing images of Wukub Kakish, the false god. Well, hang on a minute, because we're being told he's a false god and he's evil, or at least he self-magnifies and needs to be brought down a peg or two. Why would there be so many images of him there? Well, there is a school of thought that says that Wukub Kakish represents this Thuban, represents this pole star that was. And him falling out of his tree, well, the tree is the celestial axis in this account. And when he falls out of the tree, he's no longer the true god because north is not directed by his star, as it were. He's become the false god because now Polaris is the true god, as it were. And this is kind of like the astronomy that's encoded into the Popol Vuh that ties into this whole thing. And it's almost as if, kind of like whether we look at it as a Teotihuacan influence or however we look at it, we can see that there used to be, let's say, a system of archaeoastronomy that was pointing to, let's say, Thuban as representing the North Pole, the northern celestial axis of the Earth. But then because of precession, he's fallen foul of it, and now they're worshipping a new god. Now, does that mean that there was a new, let's say, kind of religion come along? It's interesting. I've been having sort of conversation with somebody who's been commenting on pictures of the Lent parades in East, like that I was taking at the weekend, and they were saying, "Oh, is it sad that like this culture is being erased?" And it's like, well, how different is it to, let's say, a Teotihuacan influence coming down and saying, "Oh yeah, that star, yeah, we're not looking at that star anymore. We're looking at that star now. We're all going to change the way we talk about things." That Wukub Kakish, yeah, you made all your monuments to him, but he's no, he's out of favor. He's out of fashion now. We're going to align everyone to a different star, to a different god, kind of thing. We see it like whether we see it religiously, politically, or astronomically. It's almost as if they're tying in the same things. And there's a really interesting thing. Here I am wearing my Pakal's tomb, t-shirt and all that kind of thing. But there's a really whilst I love the Temple of the Inscriptions, I'd say my favorite place is the cross group at Palenque. And what we see at the cross group is we have at least 3 temples with 3 different panels: the Temple of the Cross, the Temple of the Foliated Cross, and another one that show things like the ascension of Chamberlain II, like Pakau's son being crowned, and you see it with him as the, and the cross, and you see kind of like you have, let's say, the news report on it, and then you have the mythological report, and then you have the astronomical report of it. And so it's like they always encoded things in threes, in these three ways. So whenever you're looking at something, you've got to look at it as, this is what we're trying to say in history. This is what we're trying to say. We're going to turn these kings into mythological characters. Oh, by the way, they also represent stars and planets. And so it's like seeing the three things working as one. And so you're reading the same story in three different ways, depending on which panel you're looking at. And going back to that, it's like seeing this evidence of, of that. I think that they were very, very aware of these cycles. Now, there is another cycle that you may be aware of, called the Milankovitch cycle. Have you ever heard of that one? Okay, so interestingly enough, so we have our 13 Baktun cycle. Yeah, 13 Baktun, each Baktun being 394 years or something like that, 396 anyway, like coming out about 5,126 years. Like that being 1/5 of the cycle of precession is 13 Baktuns. And, kind of like seeing that, right, isn't that interesting? Because, when we look at 5 by 13 Baktuns, we're then looking at 26,500 years, right? Well, there's another really interesting cycle that also fits in with that, the Milankovitch cycle, which is about a 42,000 year cycle. Now, that's not talking about the wobble of the Earth. I mean, obviously, highly exaggerated in my, with my finger there. It's talking about the obliquity of the Earth. Okay, so the Earth goes from about 22 degrees to 24.5 degrees in its angle, which means that the line of the tropics is going to change over time. And apparently that takes about 42,500 years to cycle through that. Now, that ties in with things like, depending on how the angle is, it's kind of like when we look at our summers, when we look at our winters, when we look at our climate in general, the Milankovitch cycle has a very important effect on that. It can bring in things like ice ages, for example. And interestingly enough, we start looking at, rather than 5 by 13 Baktons, look at 5 by 20 Baktons. It's like, because I know Jeff Stray in particular was saying kind of like there is also, we get all excited about the 13 Bakton cycle, which is definitely a thing. But, if we were looking at the way that they're like counting things like pickletoons and stuff like that, they're in 20s, not in 13s. And so when we look at that 20 Bakton cycle as well, we got to start looking at, well, there's 20 times. Sorry, my mathematics is sort of like has got a bit shot there, but it's like it keys in with the Milankovitch cycle as well. And so they're looking at these cycles of ice ages, the obliquity of the sun, and that kind of thing. They were very, very aware of all of these celestial mechanics. And they're encoding it into their mathematics, they're encoding it into their calendars. The more that we see, the more that we find out. And I would say, like, I'm saying the more that we find out, but you want to study this stuff, like books like this one, Star Gods of the Maya, Susan Milbrath. This is an amazing book. And this one in particular, Anthony Aveni's Skywatchers. These books, I tell you what, I never heard anybody talking about this stuff, whether it was people here that were talking around the fire, or whether it was, the community. This is nothing new. These books are, at least 20 years old. and they are detailing, kind of like things about precession. They are detailing about the movements of planets, and that it's just such a vast subject. Trying to research and read about all of it takes a long time. But those two books, I mean, they're kind of like they're highly addictive when you start reading. Well, they are if you're a geek like me about it anyway. But like, that's where you find the evidence about the knowledge of the cycle of processions and the calendar and stuff like that. And I think they encoded it all in there.
It's interesting. Is it Chichen Itza that has the feathered serpent that shows up on the equinox? Is that the
Yeah,
pyramid, Chichen Itza?
yeah. Yeah, that's the temple of Kukulkan at Chichen Itza, and that is, again, I found, you read about it. That's a relatively modern pyramid. That's a pyramid that is, if I remember rightly, late classic or early post classic or something like that. That's, kind of like, there's that. And they reckon that it was a reproduction of this. This is the Caracol, the observatory at Chichen Itza. And it is an older thing. Now, this in particular was an observatory for Venus. And what I've seen, in fact, I think if I remember rightly, Susan Milbrath saying when she was talking about different sensors being used at different times, is like these things on the top there, they're windows facing east, north, west, and south. And when you look at it, what they're doing is they're moving the sensor depending on where Venus is, whether it's in the east, whether it's in the west, whether it's in its inferior or superior conjunction. The sensor will be placed in a different window so everybody knows where Venus is. And the alignments coming off those things are incredible. But it was almost as if the El Castillo, the Temple of Kukulkan, was kind of, I think, maybe like a late amalgamation of like lots of celestial knowledge rolled into one place. It's kind of like, right, okay, the Caracol was an older version, and they're like, let's update that thing, let's build this grand new structure that everybody's going to come and look at for 1,000 years of this wonderful alignment that shows the serpent going down the pyramid and that.
Yeah. Well, the reason I bring that up is that to me in and of itself is calling attention to the equinox.
Yes.
So, which, I mean, there's different reasons to talk about the equinox, I suppose, besides precession, but it just seems that so many of the temples around the world are using the equinox to track possession and precession and call that out and make it something that people say, oh, okay, this is about precession.
Absolutely. And I was just up at Tikal, and there is certainly astronomical alignments there. Now, another one, maybe a more famous one, is called Washaktun, and these astronomical alignments we find in things that are known as E groups. Now, an E group usually has like a temple. Let's say I'm trying to do it vertically. Let's say there's a temple structure right there, and then you're going to have this long temple to the east of it, or a long mound to the east of it. Okay, so there's your temple, there's due east. That would make that. Sorry if I get this wrong, it's all mirrored on my screen. So I have to, like, let's say, like, there's the temple. If I'm looking east, that way will be southeast, that way will be northeast. So the sun is going to rise in the equinox on the east. The sun is going to rise on the winter solstice on the southeast. The sun is going to rise on the summer solstice on the northeast, or at least say on the northern part of the temple and the southern part of the temple. And the interesting thing is the solstices are bang on. The equinoxes are a little bit varied. It's almost as if the alignment is just kind of like, it's just, you have to stand like 1.5 meters to the left or something like that to get the alignment. And it's almost as if the equinoxes there were not what they were measuring. And what you find is it might be kind of like, let's say, the true alignment is 2 days either side, let's say on the summer side. So maybe it's come something like March 24th and September 18th or something like that, which is really weird why they chose to do that, because it's there's a guy called Ivan Sprach, I think. Please forgive me, Ivan, if I don't pronounce your name right, who actually has gone around and measured these alignments. And you also find that in Anthony Aveni's book, that where, kind of like where they fall and what they were measuring, but they were absolutely using those points. And the solstice there's actually more measured. Bit disappointing. My birthday's on an equinox, so I was hoping that the equinoxes would be, kind of like more popular with them. But there is some definite alignment, like, physical evidence that the solstices were the ones that were really important to them. Now, again, why? I'm not sure. I need to do more reading. I could read forever and still feel like I don't read enough, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's kind of like they're definitely saying something with regards to, they're looking at those timings and saying that's what it is.
Do those dates shift with this 42,000 year obliquity thing? Does that affect the solstice and equinox dates at all? I forget the name of the cycle.
My honest answer is I don't know.
Yeah.
Like, I would imagine that it is going to shift. For example, if we said that it's going to shift the lines that we call the tropics of Capricorn and the tropics of Cancer, because right now they're 23.5 degrees north and south, right? And they could be 22 degrees north. So basically we could see the tropics shrinking a bit, or we could see them growing a bit. Now, if they're shrinking or growing, we know, like, well, again, theoretically, we should have our equinoxes on, well, usually it's 20th of March and 22nd of September. And we're going to have our solstices. Let's say our solstices, they're usually a bit more accurate, 21st of June, 21st of December. But the sun will be overhead on the Tropic of Cancer on the 21st of June and overhead on the equator on the equinoxes, which means that the distance or the difference means that the zenith transit of the sun may change date. Because normally, for example, here, 15 degrees north of the equator, it's 30th of April and 13th of August. Now, if we're changing the line of the tropics, surely that's going to change a little bit. Like at 15 degrees north, maybe it's going to be on a different date. But we're talking about 42,000 or 42,000 years. So it's got a long time. We got to look at that.
Yeah.
So maybe they knew about it, maybe they didn't. Now, whether it's going to change our alignment so much, that I don't know.
It's just a thought.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good thought. And it's something I'm always interested in. I said to somebody about this alignment at Takalika back, and kind of like I knew about it because obviously the researchers had written it down and that kind of thing. And they said, well, no, that's not going to change anything. And I'm like, well, like, apparently it does. We're used to our night sky being the night sky that we've seen from when we were born to when we die. But like the night sky changes.
Yeah. Makes me think what you were describing with the way the temples are set up to track the solstices on either side and the equinox in the middle. I would imagine you're familiar with Graham Hancock's work, and he just did this great new series. I don't know if you've had a chance to see it, but Ancient Apocalypse, I think it's called, on Netflix. And he talks about Serpent Mound and how in Ohio, and how Serpent Mound has that tracking based on the curves of the serpent are aligned to the solstices, and then the head of the serpent looks right at the equinox, or sorry, the solstice, summer solstice.
Yeah.
And then also in Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, they have the same kind of thing there, where they've got this range of alignments that or the solstices with the equinox in the middle. So
Yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
did it all
Yeah,
over.
I mean, I have to say I binge watched Graham's pro. I actually got
So
the wrong week because like I'm on, kind of like I receive his newsletter or whatever, and I thought it was going to be a week early. I was there ready with my Netflix at sort of 7 p.m. on the Friday before it came out. And then when it did come out, yeah, I think I'd watched all of the episodes by kind of like Sunday evening or something like that.
same for me, but
Um, yeah,
I was excited.
that's,
Been following his work for a long time.
yeah, I've got a selection of his books up there, and yeah, really like very, very like let's say influential on my whole desire to find out about this stuff. Reading Fingerprints of the Gods in 1998 or something like that, and blimey, I've got to find out more about this. And I think, again, going back to Graham and like who is, kind of like, unfortunately, he has his detractors, which is and a lot of people, kind of like, let's say, speaking with not knowing him or whatever, speaking about things out of context. But the thing that I find really interesting is what he says about things being older. Every time they dig up the ground, they find a thing is older. I think almost like one of the most interesting thing was that like that temple that he was looking at in where was it? It was somewhere in the Far East, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
showing kind of like the underground bit. 24,000 years old or something like that. It's like, this is what we need to be looking at.
Yeah.
And every time we start pushing back the timelines, and you see it here as well. I remember sort of seeing kind of like things coming out of the ground at Mirador. And the thing about the Mayan timelines, it would seem, is that they seem to be rather fluid, and people dig up something and they go, well, hang on, that's in the wrong layer to be that old, so it's got to be older. So we're going to change the timelines, and the timelines are relatively fluid, so they keep moving back,
Yeah.
which is the way it should always be. Whenever you find scientific evidence that shows that your original theory is incorrect, you have to change your theory, even if you don't want it, because you just wrote a big book about it last year, and this kind of invalidates your book or whatever. You have to take the ego out of it and say, no, okay, I was wrong. When I wrote it, I had this evidence, and that evidence was best. We had to go on it, and it was correct. Now we've got new evidence, and we're going to have to redate everything. That's the way it should work, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean, this LiDAR scanner 2017 that showed 10 times more structure in per 10. And there's so much that's going to be coming out of the Mayan world. And of course, with each new discovery, you've got to like update the data on it. I mean, obviously, I've been a big fan for many years, and like I already think that what they were doing then was incredible, amazing, and all that kind of thing. But kind of the more that we look at their mathematics, the more that we look at their astronomy and their archaeology, and their alignments and that kind of thing, the more you realize the genius of this civilization. So yeah, and I think that the one thing that I really have this strong feeling about as well is that we have to remember that this is the people here are the descendants of that civilization that brought all this stuff. Whether they were a civilization that arrived from the sea or however, I mean, at the end of the day, human beings started out in one place, migrated to another place. Like we all spread out from somewhere. We avoided the I can't remember what the name of the volcanic eruption that bottlenecked humans, as it were, bottlenecked our genetic diversity.
Yeah.
Kind of like we escaped from that. We've all gone around. We've taken our understandings and our knowledge to somewhere. And and whilst obviously I go by Carl Sagan's kind of, I think it was Carl Sagan's idea about it. There is, with billions of stars out there, the idea that there is no life out there is kind of it's not believable.
Yeah.
But I think that the mathematics, astronomy, architecture, agronomy, and all of this kind of thing, this is what the elders. This is what the ancients of these societies knew about. And the today's Maya here, today's people here, are the descendants of those incredibly advanced situations. I mean, we're all the descendants of those civilizations. We've just had our knowledge and our understanding eroded away by different political groups, usually. So sorry, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there and all that kind of thing. But kind of like I think that I don't necessarily see that ETs came down and gave this knowledge to these people, or I think these people developed it or arrived with it.
Well, related to the concept of the great year and precession, tracking it, and this is something that Hancock talks about a little bit, but it doesn't touch on it that much, is just this notion that, let's say 12,000 years ago, which was the last golden age, that humanity was a different kind of advance, not necessarily like the cultures we have today, thinking of steel frame sky rises as being an advanced thing. Even if they had those back then, anything made out of steel would have eroded away thousands of years ago, especially if there was a huge cataclysm with huge rains for thousands of years, that kind of thing. So we shouldn't necessarily expect to find evidence of anything like what we have today, even if there was something like that. But if you look at some of the buildings, like I always think of Sacsayhuaman in the Sacred Valley in Peru, with those amazing, huge megalithic blocks that are so oddly shaped but fit perfectly together, and there's no way to even fit a piece of paper in between them. And then above that level, you've got the Inca construction, which is still impressive, but it's not the same by any stretch of the imagination, And so, and there's evidence of that all over the place, all around the world. These different structures, like when I was talking to Dr. Kalaman, I mentioned the Temple of Jupiter in Lebanon, in Baalbek.
Yes,
another example
Baalbek,
of that, just unbelievable, humongous blocks, and then the Romans built on top of that. Again, they're impressive structures that the Romans built, but nothing like what was underneath. And so it seems to be, considering it's a lower level and that was built on top of it, that to me, and not to just to me, but other researchers, indicates that came before, and then a new culture came along built on top of it. And so when you've got things like carbon dated burnt wood in the in the pyramids that dates it to 2,500 years ago, that isn't necessarily when it was built. That may have been a time when they came to a site that was already there and repaired it, and that's why the carbon dating shows something that's more modern. But that these sites go back way much further back, and then the technology that was being used back then to put these things together is something that we can't even fathom today. We can barely recreate what they did.
Absolutely. The only way that you could really kind of, let's say, know about it is by finding a tooth that's under one of those stones, right? That's so far under it that the only way that tooth could have got there was by being there before the stone got put on it. And of course, then from like the chemical composition of the tooth, you probably also know, where that person came from and what their, what their dietary makeup or all that kind of thing. But I mean, like, it's what I love Graham, going back to Graham again, species with amnesia. We got absolutely no idea, so it's kind of, not no idea. We are learning. Maybe that's a better way of putting it, but like the ego arrogance of saying that we know, rather than, it's a work in process. We're learning about our history because our history has been erased. Whether that's, kind of like, let's say, whether that is deliberately or accidentally or whatever it is, kind of like, surely the main thrust should be keeping our minds open to the possibilities of what's out there, accepting what can be proved by science right now, based on the evidence that it's digging up, but understanding that we've got to have that flexibility to change it based on what gets dug up in the future as well.
What are your thoughts about the influence of the Great Year on human consciousness? That the idea that we've descended in our connection to the divine from 12,000 years ago to today, that's what the descending phase of the great year is, a loss of the connection, which speaks to why we don't have the ability to make these structures or understand how they built them in comparison. And that we reached the bottom of the wave, as it were, I think 500 years ago, and now we're ascending back up according to the concept of the great year. And
Right.
that kind of it tracks, at least from the last 500 years, from the lowest point to where we are today technologically from 500 years ago. It tracks that we're headed back up again. That's what it looks
Yes.
like to me anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I've certainly seen kind of like years ago when I was looking at the whole kind of like 2012 phenomenon and that kind of thing. The whole concept of the great year was a very big part of that. And so basically seeing again, like good friend Jeff Stray, his book on 2012 was an amazing compilation of his work, and John Major Jenkins' work as well, also very, very interesting. And coming across a great year through that, I think that, kind of like when we're looking at it, we're looking, yes, microcosm, macrocosm, and all that kind of thing with regards to where we are in time and cycles of time. 2012, is it, a peak? Is it a dip? Is it, what is it, kind of thing? Is it right even? Because other people put different dates together. I'm just looking at some things with regards to what the modern Maya are working with, what the contemporary Maya are working with regards to dating and solar years and that as well. And seeing things moving in 13, 26, 52, 104-year cycles, because this all keys in with the cycle of Venus, and it keys in with the sacred calendar, and it keys in with the Mayan solar calendars and that, which brings up the idea that 2025 is going to be 2025, 2026 is going to be an interesting changing time. And where do they all sit within, kind of like the great year cycles as well? Because, 52 years in the cycle of 25,000 years is hardly, kind of like less than a drop in the ocean, right? And yes, you certainly see things. I think that what where we are now, what we're doing, there's some amazing things that happen. There's some amazing stuff which is coming out. But, kind of like, again, go back and we're looking at the way that animals live, the way that humans work. We're busy, 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 busy doing our thing and all that kind of thing. And it's like, oh, put some stones there, build a pyramid. I mean, I'm not saying like by any stretch of the imagination they weren't highly industrious, because they were, but maybe kind of like things were different, and kind of like what they valued within life might have been different, and maybe they weren't. I don't know. It would be nice to, of course, it would be nice to have, let's say, been there and be able to say for certainty, this is what people would do, this is the way that they live, and that kind of thing. And I know that from what is being dug up, they can get a great understanding of how people lived, or what their diet was and that kind of thing. But even so, if we're looking at, let's say, the classic era of the Maya, we're only looking like 1,500 years ago, and on the cycle of the great year, we're still nowhere on that, right?
Yeah.
It'd be really interesting to see, like these things where they're looking at 24,000 years ago. The dating of the Sphinx, that it was possibly put down in the age of Leo. And I tried to do the calculation sort of in my head the other day about going back to the age of Leo, which I think was something like 10,000 BC or 10,000 or 12,000 BC or something like that. And that's great. But then you got to remember it had to have the weathering on it. And that weathering didn't happen overnight 10,000 or 12,000 years ago. So you then got to go back another 24,000 years or 25,000 years, which you give 36,000 BC.
Yeah.
As, kind of like if you're going to date it on that kind of thing. So it's really interesting to see the way that things are, kind of like constructed in this way.
Yeah. I remembered something that I wanted to ask you about from earlier that I forgot, and that is Hancock at Göbekli Tepe talks about a specific stela that has a bird holding a disc, sun looks like a sun disc, and that
Yeah.
I don't know if it was him or someone else that drew a comparison to the Maya talking about the dark rift in the Milky Way in the center of the galaxy, and that
Uh-huh.
and that sort of Hancock talks about that it points to our time specifically, that stela in Göbekli Tepe specifically points to this period of time because the sun is moving through that dark rift from like 1992 to 2032 or something. It's like a 40-year period of time, and that the Maya were somehow pointing at that too as an important time.
Yeah.
Where that came from, but I know that's something related to one of the ball courts.
Yes, it's John Major Jenkins'
Hmm.
work. He talks a lot about it in Maya Cosmogenesis 2012, and it's the ball court at Izapa. And the
That's right.
whole point is it's like there's the sun going through the goal hoop and that kind of thing, which is really interesting. And, I think there is something in it. I think that, the Maya, I know when we look at their calculations, their planetary stuff, they're geniuses, they're experts at it.
Yeah.
However, I would also like to add something in there. And maybe it's just us, but as you know, I'm also a keen sky watcher. And what I can say right now is that, like, you really don't see the Milky Way much between November and end of January. So they would have had to extrapolate because you can't see galactic center on December 21st at sunrise, because like the galactic center right now it is visible until 5:20 a.m. or something like that. And so just to be aware, this is again where like we have theories and ideas. We also have to go and look at the sky ourselves to understand when people say, oh, this is the day when like the sun rises in the galactic center. It's like, well, they must have known more about it than us, because you're never going to see that, because the sun would wash the Milky Way out completely, regardless of light pollution. The dawn would mean that you could never see that phenomenon happening.
Interesting.
It would have to be something that was calculated for it to work like that.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that it was nothing that would be beyond these amazing astronomers that the Maya were. But it's also interesting just to say, okay, what really goes on in the sky? Let's go and have a look and see how this really works.
Yeah.
When I can muster the energy, unfortunately I missed it in the new moon like last week or so, a couple of weeks ago, because I really wanted to get up and take some shots of the Milky Way over the lake during the new moon, where it's just starting to rise at kind of like 3 o'clock in the morning and that. But astrophotography is a labor of love and one of not much sleep, and I need all the sleep I can get right now.
Yeah, I feel you. Yeah.
Yeah,
So much we don't yet know.
absolutely. So exciting to be. I think this is one of the, there is obviously some things which we are very, some big things which are not right with the world that we need to help each other to sort out. But we also could see that living right now, what we have going on in our world, what we're discovering about our past, all of these kind of things, that we're in a position right now, we're like, my goodness, could you imagine if this had been our grandparents' generation or whatever? Grandma, how was it to live in that era when you discovered that, history was like 100,000 years older than you thought it was or whatever, because I think we're right on the cusp of that kind of thing.
I think so too. I think it's a very exciting time to be alive. I think, like you said, we'll look back on it and just, wow. And I think that's part of the reason why Hancock's work is suppressed, is that if it turns out that his work and, Jenkins and these other guys are at least pointing in the right direction, that's going to overturn so much. It's such a fundamental thing to
Yeah,
believe the sort of linear story of our evolution from hunter-gatherers to civilization to modern civilization. There was nothing, there's no hiccup in there in the past that would upturn, it's so
yeah,
it's so important
absolutely.
in terms of holding the narrative together of the current people in control.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
that's where you go back to the keeping of time.
yeah,
When I said that, I've said to people often when I'm giving readings or whatever, kind of like the system of time that we adhere to in much of the Western world, because it's like that I always go back to the Venn diagram, which shows you the what I don't know that I don't know being the biggest part of it, and all that kind of thing. We are aware that other civilizations on our planet right now live by different calendars, live by a calendar where Saturday and Sunday aren't the most important days of a week because we've got a weekend and we're going to have days off. There might be Friday and Saturday for them, or whatever it might be. Or they don't even call them Friday and Saturday.
yeah,
It's like we are very like we're looking at the top of the newspaper. Well, nobody looks at the tops of the newspaper anymore, but we, or at our phone, and it's telling us a Gregorian date with a, good with a day based on a 7-day week.
yeah,
And when we look at that, that's all going back to the introduction by Pope Gregory of the Gregorian calendar, which took over from the Julian calendar, and it's all going back to the Holy Roman Empire. And so, kind of like we're looking at it, that's our perception of time. And I think that is the matrix. That's what keeps us under control. Changing our system of time is what liberates us somewhat.
yeah. I'll always be grateful to Ian Lungold for that, for his description of the Gregorian calendar as insidious. And it changed my whole way of thinking about just the nature of our the thing. He talked about the biggest dogma on earth is, what day is it? No one even questions it.
Yeah.
It just is, according to the Gregorian calendar.
I always had like a friend of mine, she would always ask me, what day is it? And I would say, like, I would invariably give her the wrong answer because it would either be saying, right, okay, well, it's 7 Imosh. No, I mean, what day is it? Oh, it's the 28th of February. No, what day is it? Oh, it's Tuesday. It's kind of like, whereas it's kind of interesting that you realize, okay, there's many different ways of even saying what day is it.
Yeah, yeah,
The 8th day of this moon, or whatever.
yeah. Well, and even the names of the months, I can't decide whether Julius Caesar was a good guy or a bad guy historically, like I feel maybe he's both, like anybody has the capacity to be both, but I think it was his influence that added January, and July, I believe, was named after him, and August is named after Augustus.
Yes.
He extended the calendar to make it 12 months instead of 10 months, I think. But that,
Yes.
December Deci is 10, September is 7, but it's the ninth month, so I, I just think that's so interesting.
Yeah. And it's like, why did they not rename those final months? Because it just doesn't make sense anymore. And it's like, it's an elephant in the room, isn't it? It's
Yeah,
like, oh, you know what? We're just going to change the system. We're going to change your system of time. Your perception of reality will now be changed based on our names. And we're going to, kind of like do something different, which is very, very weird.
yeah,
And if you can't, like I say, if you can't see that as a control system when you start looking for it, but then you've also got, let's say, well, I was going to say a failed calendar, Now, I don't know if I've mentioned this before, but when I'm like, one of the apps that I use is called Geek Calendar Tool. It's only available on Android, unfortunately. It's a great thing for calculating people's Mayan birthdays. But the interesting thing is it has all of these other calendars in there. And one of them is the French Revolutionary calendar.
Hmm.
Whoever's heard of that?
Yeah.
Somebody's counting it. Somebody invented it. It was I mean, it was supposed to be this new calendar for the post-revolution France. Now, whether anybody in France still counts it or not, I don't know. But it's really interesting. Hey, you know what? We're going to create an independent new system that's independent of the church. What we're going to do? We're going to create our own calendar first, because changing the perception of time amongst the people is a massive part of it. Is, again, I go back to saying it's like the elephant in the room is that, when we're looking at ceremonies, for example, the job of an akik is to give people an understanding of what day to make ceremony. A ik from tomorrow, for example, great day for ceremony, about fresh air, about your breath, about your words, and all that kind of thing. But when I look at it, I always see, okay, what day is the new moon on? The full moon. What day is the equinox on? What day is the kind of like it aligned to? Because we'll see that you see it a lot on social media. Hey, it's the 21st of March. Let's make an equinox ceremony. It's like, actually, the equinox was at 6:42 on the 20th of March. Your ceremony's a day out, which means your magic's not going to work. Why is it not going to work? Because you're basing it on a Gregorian calendar day, rather than going out and following the astronomical alignment, which shows you that it happens earlier, because that's where the power is. Same with the cross quarter days, Samhain, Imox, Lunasa, and Beltane. It's like they're not like 1st of February, 1st of May, 1st of August, and 1st of November. They are going to vary based on what the sun is doing, what the Earth's orbit is doing. And if we really want to tap into our magic, we have to look at it from that point of view, because saying that it happens then, or, oh, well, that's not very convenient because it's on a Thursday at 7 a.m. or something like that. We'll do our ceremony on Saturday. It's like, well, if you get disillusioned with your chosen magic, then it's probably because you're doing it on the wrong day,
That's why my intuition tells me that there's a problem with tropical astrology because of the fixed dates, and how, like a bunch of people were just making forecasts about the new moon in Pisces that just happened, but the moon physically was in Aquarius when it was new.
Yeah.
They're holding maybe their ceremony on the same day, so they're actually holding it at the right time, but they've got the wrong intention, let's say, because they've focused on the next sign. I don't know if that makes a difference. It feels weird to me that it's not honing in on what's actually happening. It's basing it on something that was true 2,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Because there's plenty of people out there that swear by tropical astrology, and I've had some amazing synchronicities related to tropical astrology myself. So it's not necessarily that there's no magic. It's just maybe a different kind of magic, or magic that that produces a result that wasn't intended because the intention is not completely authentic.
Yeah. I look at it from the point of view of, people talk about the like numerology, what I would call Western numerology, based on your birth date in the Gregorian calendar. I said, well, that person did my numerology and it was absolutely spot on. And I'd say it is absolutely spot on for where you fit into the matrix.
Yeah.
Because it's using the matrix of the patriarch, the Gregorian system of time. It will show you exactly where you are, but what it doesn't show you is where you need to go. Because it doesn't have an interest in showing you where you need to go. And so from that, got to break out of the patriarch, out of the Gregorian system of time into a different system of time to understand, right, okay, it's all very good to, as a navigational tool. We're talking about the navigation of time, really, the navigation of reality. And we're always going to need to know where we are on the planet, or in time, or in space, or whatever it might be, which we can get from that. But it's like, yeah, but which direction do we actually need to be heading in? Because, there are some systems of time which are not designed to show you which direction you're going to be heading in, because if you did, you know where the exit is. They don't want you to know where the exit is, kind of thing.
Interesting. Yeah, that makes sense. I often describe to people when I'm talking about 12, the zodiac versus Ophiuchian constellation astrology. The guy that taught me about Ophiuchus gets really upset when people refer to Ophiuchus as a sign, because it's not a sign, it's a constellation. And the 12 sign zodiac system is based on the 12 constellations, but it's not actually matching up with them because of the dating issue, and because the constellations are not all 30 degrees of the sky. There's all these issues with that. And I often, when I talk about tropical astrology or West or 12 sign astrology versus 13 constellation astrology, I refer to it as like 12 sign astrology is kind of what you were born with. 13 constellation astrology is your unrecognized or unrealized potential, where you can go. So it's similar to what you just said there.
Yes.
And that's just, again, my intuition. No one told me that that's true. It just feels that way because it seems to tap into things that are there, but I didn't know were there until I became aware that it's a potential that I'm not accessing. And then I put energy into it and it blooms like a seed.
Yeah. Cool.
Good stuff.
All right.
Well, I had in mind that we do an introduction to the calendar, and we went the other direction and went super advanced.
Yeah. Read the introduction last. That's the way to read a book, right?
Exactly.
Cool.
Well, thank you so much, Mark.
You're so welcome.
Always
Great to see you, Patrick.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
Likewise.
Appreciate your wisdom.
You're welcome. Cool.
Thank you, brother. We'll see you soon. I'll see you tomorrow.
Yeah. See you soon. Cheers.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.